Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special lecture. This special lecture is special in many ways because on the one hand, it is a cooperation of a department of the law faculty with many other departments in the humanities. So the department of the law faculty is the Department for Global Governance. What we do is that we focus on law in a very international and interdisciplinary manner, including also perspectives that relate to history. This is why we are here today. So the second partner is, of course, the department, the Institute of History of the University of Graz. And the third partner is the Center for Inter-American Studies. So we are glad that we have built this bridge from the law faculty to the other centers as well. What we are trying to do today is to focus on Empire's daughters and learn more about girlhood, about Britain's colonial past. And this topic will be introduced to us by an expert coming from Ohio State University. Professor Elizabeth Dillenburg is assistant professor at Ohio State University, and she teaches modern Europe and European colonialism. Her focus is also on gender studies, and this will all be perspectives that will enrich today's discussion. I met Elizabeth Dillenburg at the Center for Austrian Studies in the US. Might be surprising for some of you that in the US there are universities that have a particular focus on Austria, because Austria seems so small on the map. But you know, we have a big past, so to say, as well. So this Center for Austrian Studies is not only focusing on current Austrian developments, but also on the former Austrian and Habsburg Empire. And this is where Elizabeth Dillenburg was working. She was also working on the yearbook for Austrian studies. So for any of you who are interested in dealing with Austrian studies, this is also a perfect place for your publications in a US-based book. Our discussant for today's lecture and event will be Professor Heidrun Zettelbauer. She is a professor for cultural and gender history at the Institute for History, and she will critically address the talk. And afterwards, for all of you or your friends that may miss the talk, we will record it and we will share it via our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in this or similar events, we have a lecture pool set online on our YouTube channel. Just Google for Global Governance, University of Graz, and you will find it. So with no further ado, I will hand over to Heidrun and Elizabeth. Heidrun is going to be the moderator, and please enjoy the evening. And Elizabeth, thank you very much for coming to Graz.
I first just wanted to extend my thanks to many, many people, including Professor Zettelbauer, for moderating this event. I also wanted to thank Professor Pirker for this opportunity and for making this event possible. And of course, also to Xenia Radichnova for all of her work in planning the logistics for this. And I just also wanted to say thank you to the organizers of the different series, the Decolonizing History, the Global Governance Lectures, and the Center for Inter-American Studies. As Professor Pirker mentioned, I worked as a research assistant when I was completing my PhD at the University of Minnesota at the Center for Austrian Studies that they have there. And when I was working at the Center for Austrian Studies, I heard so much about Graz and the university there. So it is such a wonderful opportunity for me to be here, such a privilege and honor to be here and to share my work with you today. So I'll be talking today about my recently published book, Empire's Daughters. When I wrote Empire's Daughters, my goal was to analyze how girls and ideas of girlhood were central to the British Empire and to better understand how the empire shaped girls' lives. When we think about the British Empire, perhaps the first images that come to mind are ones like these. But of course, the empire was not just the domain of generals, statesmen, rulers, or elites. It infused people's everyday lives and shaped their experiences in myriad ways. In my book, Empire's Daughters, and in this presentation today, I want to focus on these other images of empire. What were the experiences of empire like for these girls? How did they understand and engage with the empire? What roles did they have in the imperial project? So these are some of the questions that animated the writing of my book and that I want to explore with you today. Now, on this slide, I have outlined the key topics that I plan to cover in the presentation. So I'm going to begin by talking about some of the challenges I had in doing this research. I also will be talking about why I decided to focus on this specific organization, the Girls Friendly Society, and then looking at how the society can offer insight into girls' experiences and participation in the British Empire, specifically focusing on their empire education programs, their migration programs, and their programs for girls of color. And finally, I will explore the organization's decline and what this organization can tell us about girlhood and the legacies of colonialism today. So, as I mentioned in writing Empire's Daughters, my goal was to better understand how girls experienced the empire and were central to the British Empire. But there is an enormous challenge with this endeavor. How do I find girls in the archive? Girls, and especially girls' voices, are not found in the traditional records of empire, like colonial office reports, parliamentary records, or newspapers. And you can see an example of some of these, what we might consider more traditional records of empire. So I knew when I began working on this project that it was going to be very difficult to find girls' voices in the archives, but it proved to be even more challenging than I anticipated. And some of you might have similar experiences. I have many what I call archive fail stories, sort of spending all day, right, hours in the archive, chasing down leads, thinking you found a really promising avenue of research, only to come away with finding nothing, hitting all these dead ends. Now, one way that I dealt with the challenges of the archive was to use a broad range of sources, including these more traditional sources of empire that I just showed, but also memoirs, housekeeping manuals, and personal correspondences. And here are some other sources that I use to a certain degree in my work. But within these various sources, I was able to find more information about girls' lives. But the key problem with these sources is that girls' perspectives were still missing, that oftentimes it was adults talking about girls. And so I still didn't have what girls were thinking and experiencing from these sources. However, girls eventually did emerge from the archive. When I would look through the archival catalog, searching for sources about girls in the empire, the records of one organization kept emerging, the Girls Friendly Society, or GFS. Now, I have some images here of the GFS, and at first I was not at all interested in this organization. As you might be able to tell from these pictures, it seems like something of a rather parochial organization. Not many scholars had written about the GFS, but those scholars who did write about it really talked about it in the context of the Anglican Church and how it was part of a more conservative movement in Britain. So I thought this doesn't hold any relevance to my research. I should say that actually the Girls Friendly Society is still in existence today. So it was one of these numerous youth organizations that emerged in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And today, this year, actually, it's celebrating its 150th anniversary, but it's not that well known because it was eclipsed by the more popular Girl Guides. That is the British equivalent of the Girl Scouts. And this is something that I'll return to towards the end of my presentation. So as I mentioned, I was not that interested in this organization to start out with, but what I found once I began to search through the archives of the organization is that it was not simply this parochial organization as I had first envisioned, but it was one that was deeply embedded and invested in the empire. So within the first decade of its foundation in 1875, it had established branches throughout the empire. And by the commencement of the 20th century, it had transformed into a worldwide organization with over 240,000 girls and women in around 1,400 branches throughout the British Empire. And the image that you see on the slide is actually a cover of one of the many periodicals that were produced by the Girls Friendly Society. And it shows the location of its various branches. But what I just wanted to emphasize is really the global reach of this organization. Now, as part of this imperial work, it also would develop immigration programs as well as education programs. The immigration programs were to arrange for basically the safe passage of girls and women throughout the empire. And the immigration or the education programs were really to teach girls about the British Empire and their role in it. So what I realized then in exploring these records of the GFS is that this organization really acted as a microcosm of empire. And through studying the GFS, we can better understand the complexities of girls' engagement in the empire and how the construction of girlhood, conceptualizations of whiteness, and British colonial power were inextricably linked. The GFS's concerted efforts to educate and immigrate girls demonstrated how the British Empire depended on the labor and mobility of girls and young women. And girls not only supported directly and indirectly systems of colonial power, but also resisted them. And it's these complexities of girls' engagement in the British Empire that I want to explore more today. And I wanted to explore this really first by looking at the GFS's empire education programs more closely. So the GFS had several empire education programs that encouraged girls to learn more about the empire. And again, the goal was to transform them into empire builders. The GFS organized a variety of activities along these lines. It included things like essay competitions, lantern lectures, and pen pal programs, all of which centered around imperial themes. But the image that you see on the slide is actually for a game. It's for a game that was basically used to prepare girls for membership in the Girls Friendly Society. But what I wanted to emphasize, and I'm not sure how clear it is, but a lot of the questions that were sort of educating girls about the Girls Friendly Society also involved the empire. So there's one question up there that says, you know, where is the Girls Friendly Society to be found? And it basically says wherever there are English speaking people. And then another question over here relates to purity. But what I wanted to emphasize is that it says, you know, that purity means trying to be like Christ, white and clean and straight. It means fighting against all that is bad and helping to make our empire full of good homes. So we get this sense of how the GFS's ideology, there's a lot to unpack there that we can talk about more later, but what I want to show really is how the GFS's core values and their ideology were sort of very much interlinked with the empire. Now, another key educational tool that the GFS used was periodicals. The GFS had several newsletters, almost all of which contained regular features about the empire. So you can see, for instance, on the slide, this is a newsletter that was produced called Friendly Leaves, but they ran a series about our colonies that were educating girls about British colonies. In 1913, it would actually begin a periodical specifically devoted to the empire called The Empire and Beyond. And you can see a page of that in the center there. Now, what I also just wanted to note is that within these newsletters, what we often see is a heavy emphasis placed on the GFS as part of a family. So even though it was an imperial organization, it would often frame itself as a family. And I realize that it's going to be very small, but in the highlighted section, you can see it says that we are a very large family of the GFS. There are thousands of GFS candidates at home and abroad, all trying to help in different ways. And then I have here sort of pages from another newsletter. So one of the regular columns in the newsletter was what our candidates are doing. And basically this column would often talk about what girls in different parts of the empire were doing who were part of the GFS. And again, it talks about how they are little sisters across the sea, right? So there's this family imagery that we see recurring again and again within the GFS, that we are all one big family. And we also get that sense if we look at images here, for instance. So this is actually, again, an image from the newsletter, but it gives you that sense that these girls are sort of together as this family. And I'll talk more about how we see the emergence of this family imagery in other GFS activities more in a moment. But we can also see the GFS was very much involved in organizing imperial celebrations. So I have here a photo of the girls celebrating the holiday of Empire Day, which was basically a holiday celebrated in Britain and throughout British territories, all meant to instill imperial pride and patriotism. So we have bigger events like this, but also even smaller events like this one that you can see pictured on the slide. So this is a garden party in the Yorkshire area of England. But at this garden party, girls learned about the different countries where the GFS existed, and then they dressed up in the costumes of those countries. So we can see the different ways that the empire really tried to instill patriotism and encourage girls to take an active interest in it. Now, the hope was that this interest would translate into girls' desire to immigrate and help build up British societies abroad. And to illustrate more how this worked, I wanted to highlight two cultural forms that were central to the GFS's empire education programs. And the first of these cultural forms are pageants and plays. So in the early 20th century, what was called pageant fever struck England. While pageants had a long history extending back to the Middle Ages, their popularity in England spread in the early 1900s, and they became staples in schools, youth organizations, and in community life. And the GFS was not immune to this pageant fever, as it was sometimes called pageantitis. And on the slide, you can see an image of one such pageant. So this pageant was called The Quest, and it was actually specifically created for the GFS to celebrate its 50th anniversary in 1925. And you can get a sense that these pageants could be quite elaborate affairs. And that also comes through in these images here of other GFS pageants. Now, the empire formed a prominent theme in pageants and plays, and these pageants and plays would advertise and promote the GFS's imperial work and specifically its missionary programs. So these pageants and plays educated girls about what it meant to be a missionary, what missionary life was like, and gave them the opportunity, in a sense, to rehearse the role of missionaries. The GFS then hoped that girls would sort of fulfill these roles as adults. So in a sense, they were practicing these roles of being missionaries when they grow up. The hope was that they would go out and actually be missionaries. So within then these pageants, we see that missionaries, but by extension girls, occupied a central place in the imperial story. Africa, and especially India, were common settings of missionary plays and pageants. And in these performances, girls acted as nurses and doctors to Indian and African women, and at times assumed the guise of Indian and African women. So here we have a photograph of a branch in Wales performing a missionary play. But what I want to emphasize about this photo is that I know it might not be that visible, but it actually does feature girls in brown face and wearing Indian clothing. So through the use of blackface and brownface, these performances really reaffirmed the otherness of girls from India and other colonies, and also the whiteness of the English performers. We can also see that in some other photos here of similar pageants and plays. So these pageants help to reinforce ideas of racial difference by emphasizing the supposedly lowly status of girls from regions like India and Africa, and the responsibility of white girls to rectify this situation by saving these women. So what I just want to emphasize about pageants and plays is that they provided these spaces where gender and racial roles were constructed, rehearsed, and performed. And by enacting ideas of racial difference and the supposed superiority of white girls and women, these pageants and plays were really instrumental to imaginings of the empire at the time and the construction of white imperial identities. Like pageants and plays, scrapbooks on the surface may seem like innocuous and apolitical forms of entertainment, but they were actually powerful vehicles of imperial ideology and propagated myths central to British colonialism. The GFS organized scrapbook competitions and also exchange programs to teach girls about the empire. And I wanted to take a moment to focus on two scrapbooks created as part of this exchange program. One was created by various branches in West Australia, which you can see pictured on the slide, and the other was created by a GFS branch in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Now, both of these scrapbooks were produced around 1930 as part of these exchange programs. And with the exchange programs, girls from one part of the empire would compile a book about their own branch and region and then send it to branches in other parts of the empire. So both of these scrapbooks were actually then sent to England once they were completed. And as you can see from the images on the slide, these volumes would feature drawings, photographs, and essays that gave insight into girls' lives. But one of the things that I think is really unique and exciting about these scrapbooks is that they were created by girls for an audience of girls. And it gave girls sort of this rare forum where they could act as experts about colonial life, about colonial history, and geography. Now, within these scrapbooks, like we saw in the newsletters, we see familial and friendly imagery form a recurring motif. So I have on here a couple essays that are included in the West Australia scrapbook. And you can see that they begin with salutations like to dear GFS friend and also dear sister candidates overseas. And similar to what we saw in scrapbooks, in newsletters, scrapbooks would contain photographs that reaffirm the sense of community and camaraderie by showing girls appearing together almost as a family. Now, another theme that appears within these scrapbooks is an emphasis on the modernity of these regions. Descriptions within the scrapbooks wanted to portray and show that Port Elizabeth and West Australia should not be written off as these unrefined backwaters. For instance, I have here an essay that was included in the Port Elizabeth scrapbook. And it begins by dismissing any idea that it is a wild and untamed place, saying that there will be no thrilling accounts of encounters with lions and tigers. The essay also highlights the town's features, including an up-to-date hotel, a fine public library, and also shops which contain anything almost that mankind or womankind could want. Now, photographs also would reaffirm these descriptions. So I have here sort of another page from the Port Elizabeth scrapbook, but you can see that sort of it would contain things like saying one of the finest memorials in the world, so it was sort of really emphasizing that these were spaces of progress, modernity, and civilization. The portrayal of African and Aboriginal peoples in the scrapbooks complemented colonial objectives by projecting idealized versions of colonial societies that centered around whiteness. Although the GFS had branches for girls of color in both South Africa and Australia, there is little mention of them. The GFS sought to construct an image of the organization and by extension, these colonial societies as white, homogeneous, and racially pure spaces. When African or Aboriginal people appear in the scrapbooks, they are used for specific purposes, namely to reaffirm the notion that British civilization and culture were superior and that it was British duty to quote unquote civilize other societies. So for instance, images within the West Australia scrapbook, which you can see pictured here, would reaffirm sort of this transition of Aboriginal people from being primitive to being civilized. So one photograph of an Aboriginal man that you can see pictured at the top contains the caption, and I know it's hard to read, but it basically describes him as a drunken heathen who previously, but he is now a good Christian. Aboriginal children are pictured playing cricket and boxing. On other pages, Aboriginal men are pictured attending church, Aboriginal women waiting and drinking tea. So for the British, these images really served as these undeniable markers of the success of its civilizing mission of empire. So one thing that I want to emphasize about these scrapbooks is that they can't really be taken as neutral or authentic representations of colonial life, and instead presented how the GFS wished for it in colonial societies more broadly to be seen as civilized, modern, and white, where African and Aboriginal people were separate and carefully controlled. The pervasiveness of the empire in scrapbooks, as well as plays and pageants, indicates the centrality of empire to the GFS and girls' lives in this period. And one thing that I want to emphasize, though, about the pageants, plays, and scrapbooks is that girls were not passive observers. Instead, we see how girls, through their active participation in the construction of scrapbooks and in the performance of pageants and plays, were instrumental to the creation and circulation of ideas and images about empire, race, and girlhood. The GFS tried to make its imaginings of colonial society that it presented in scrapbooks, pageants, and plays a reality through its immigration programs. So the GFS hoped that its empire education programs would transform white girls into empire builders who would migrate from England to the colonies. And to this end, the GFS would actually establish its own immigration department in 1883, and it called it the Department for Members Emigrating. And I have on the slide some records related to that department. But this maybe raises the question of why. Why did the GFS become so invested in the immigration of girls and young women? The leaders of the GFS viewed immigration as an antidote to really myriad problems at home and abroad in the empire. And this idea is actually encapsulated in a speech by Ellen Joyce, who you can see pictured on the slide. Now, she was the founder and led the Department for Members Emigrating. And she would state in a speech that immigration is an open door of salvation to many of our girls, an important preventative work. I think so on these grounds. It seems to me that if you remove temptation, you remove crime. And therefore, by removing the overpopulation of women from this country and sending them to a country where men are largely in excess of women, you adopt one of the greatest means of checking crime. Now, Joyce's speech touches upon many of the key justifications for immigration, including that it rebalanced the population by transporting girls and women from Britain to the colonies, which had a disproportionate number of white men. And it was seen that this sort of immigration, as we can see, especially from the last line, that this was going to solve the problems of poverty and crime. Now, just to contextualize Joyce's views and make the point that she was not alone in her ideas, I wanted to share with you a couple of images from around the same time. So she's really building upon prevailing rhetoric at this time. Now, this first image that we can see here is actually from a cartoon from 1869. Now, it is actually criticizing the practice of immigration, of immigrating poor children. But what I wanted to share with you, I wanted to share this cartoon with you because it shows how prevalent this idea was, right? So the people who are pictured on the slide are people who are involved in immigration programs for children. So there's sort of this idea that you can just scoop them up out of the gutter and send them away, and that is going to solve poverty. Now, we can also see that in this image here, and this image comes from Dr. Barnardo's Homes. Now, Dr. Barnardo's Homes was actually probably the most famous immigration organization or program for children. It transported tens of thousands of children between the 1880s and 1960s to British colonies, primarily Canada and Australia. But why I wanted to show this cover from Dr. Barnardo's Homes is here again, we can see how this organization, much like the GFS, framed its work as saving the white race by removing children from the perceived dangers of poverty and urban life. Now, for Joyce and others, immigration was not just a national reform project, but one that would benefit all parts of the empire. In their capacities as future homemakers, wives, and mothers, girls helped to ensure the futurity of the British Empire and make colonial societies more white. Now, immigration not only removed children from the negative influences associated with poverty, but also allowed them to grow up in the supposedly more wholesome environment of the colonies. And here again, I want to return to the words of Ellen Joyce, who you can see pictured on the slide. Now, she would give a speech to a conference that was organized by the GFS specifically about the empire in 1912. And she stated the following at this conference. The GFS has done the very best imperial work that has been done in sending women to become mothers of a race not dwarfed by poverty or cramped by pressure, as in the nest and nursery of the motherland. So here she's talking about England, but free, contented, God-fearing women in the great garden of the British Empire. And again, just to contextualize Joyce's views and emphasize that she was not alone in her ideas, I have some images here to show you from around the same time. So the image that you can see here is actually from William Booth, who orchestrated another migration program. But he had this image, and I know that it's hard to read, but you can see that basically it's talking about how immigration is moving people from the city colony, where it's very dark, out to the farm colony where things are open, green, and beautiful. And we also get that sense here from this other image. So, you can see that here in England, this is what a family's life is like. But there, that sort of they can enjoy all this prosperity that's not available to them in England. It's called immigration a remedy. So we can see that this idea that the colonies provided this open, healthy, idyllic environment full of prosperity, abundance, and new opportunities was very common at the time. Now, the colonies were in desperate need of girls to immigrate to work as domestic servants. And we can see from this poster here that immigration societies sought to entice girls to travel to the colonies by really putting forward a very romanticized idea of life in the colonies. So the colonies were portrayed almost as a paradise for servants. Oftentimes it was stated in immigration propaganda that the work is not very heavy. It's much easier than it is in Britain, and also that that servants are treated basically as extended members of the family. Now, behind these idealized portrayals in immigration propaganda, the reality, of course, was far, far more complex. Many immigrants, including girls who traveled under the auspices of the Girls Friendly Society, did take on these roles as servants, wives, and mothers, migrating to the colonies to create white homes. But some often found life in the colonies very different than the great garden that had been promised to them in immigration propaganda. And to highlight this point, I wanted to share with you the story of Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook. Eliza Hobbs and Eliza Cook arrived in Bulawayo, Rhodesia, that is present-day Zimbabwe, in June 1901, and were contracted to work for 2 years for the Robinson household. However, upon their arrival, Hobbs and Cook found life in Rhodesia laborious, alien, and full of hardships. And I have on the slide one of the letters that Hobbs wrote to Ellen Joyce, who had arranged for her passage, and she was the one who was featured on the previous slides. Now, she wrote about her difficulties in adjusting to life in Bulawayo and described her sense of loneliness and isolation, confiding, "I cannot tell you how earnestly I have longed for one friend since I have been here." In contrast to finding a land full of sunshine with greater freedom and opportunities, as had been promised to her in immigration propaganda, she described the challenges of being in a strange land, penniless. Hobbs and Cook ultimately decided to leave their situations 8 months after their arrival. However, they were eventually arrested and put on trial, essentially for breaking their contract. It was for the infringement of the masters and servants' ordinances. At the trial, Hobbs testified that she would rather go to prison than return to work for her mistress, Sidonia Robinson, stating that if she was compelled to stay, it would mean that the law seems to uphold tyranny. She also pleaded her case to Joyce in her letters, writing, "We have done no crime, only took ourselves out of an unhappy life." Now, the magistrate ruled in favor of Robinson and against Hobbs and Cook, and ordered Hobbs and Cook to basically pay a fine of £2 and return to work for the Robinsons to fulfill their contract. Hobbs lamented the verdict and broader legal system in another letter to Ellen Joyce, writing, "It is not justice. The law seems made for moneyed people." Ultimately, Robinson released Hobbs from her contract, but unable to pay for her passage back to England, Hobbs remained in Bulawayo and found a new position as a housekeeper. GFS organizers frequently framed immigration in terms of imperial duty, but such notions had little meaning for immigrants like Hobbs and Cook, who were faced with innumerable hardships of traveling to and living in a strange land. Now, as evidenced by the concerted education and immigration programs, the GFS had a clear view of how colonial society should be structured and the role of immigrant girls and young women in them. But girls' participation in the empire was anything but straightforward and defies easy categorization. And to underscore this point, I just wanted to briefly mention the story of Violet Paul. Violet Paul was a member of the GFS who traveled from London to India to marry a man, W.E. Davis. Now, on the surface, it seems like she's fulfilling exactly what the GFS organizers wanted, right? She's going out to the colonies, making a white home, except she wasn't, because it turns out that W.E. Davis is an Anglo-Indian man. So he's a man of both British and Indian descent. And so there's sort of this voluminous correspondence about this, because Paul was basically subverting the goal of the GFS, right? She was not going out to create a white home. So this alarms the GFS organizers. So as Eliza Hobbs, Eliza Cook, and Violet Paul demonstrate, immigrants did not unquestioningly follow the plans of the organizers. Immigration organizers viewed girls as passive figures, and their concerns and well-being were often regarded as secondary or even immaterial to broader organizational objectives. But in doing so, they failed to take into account the ways that girls would resist the poor conditions and hardships they faced in the colonies and undermine these imperial goals. The GFS leadership ignored the voices of its girl members, but they did so to their own detriment. And this is also apparent if we look at the GFS's treatment of girls of color. So one thing that I should note is that the GFS's immigration programs were multi-directional. They didn't just go from England to the colonies. They also went from colony to colony and colonies back to England. So they did develop immigration schemes for girls, including girls of color, to travel from the colonies like India to England. And the idea was that they would fulfill critical labor needs in England. So specifically, England needed things like children's nurses, domestic servants, and also medical workers. And on the slide, I have information about one of these schemes for girls from India to go to England. However, these programs were ultimately not very successful because racist attitudes prevented girls from finding both places to stay, but also employment once they arrived in England. These programs were also doomed by the girls themselves and also girls' families. They realized that these programs were not actually uplifting or improving their lives, as GFS organizers often claimed, but really a mode to exploit their labor. So the failure of these programs is really symptomatic of the GFS's uneasy and complicated, to put it very mildly, relationship with race. There were often not enough white girls in the colonies to sustain the organization, making the inclusion of girls of color essential to the GFS's survival in Britain's colonies. And although the GFS admitted girls of color, it did so with considerable reservations and did not intend for girls of color to be full members of the GFS in the same way that white girls were. For instance, in South Africa, it refused to financially support branches for color, that is multiracial girls, and insisted on separate branches for them, and even worked to exclude colored and Black girls from the GFS altogether. Now, girls recognized their secondary status within the organization. And this lack of equality between GFS branches for white girls and colored girls led colored girls to leave the GFS. And in 1906, there's a report of a branch for colored girls in Cape Town withdrawing from the GFS because, as the report notes, they are not on an equal footing with the white members. They gain nothing by belonging to the GFS. The society gains strength from them. Now, the report will also allude that this is not a unique incident, that similar incidents occurred at other cities in South Africa, including East London and Port Elizabeth. So the closure of these branches demonstrates that iniquities within the organization did not go uncontested. The GFS encouraged its members to think of themselves as belonging to a large family, an imperial sisterhood, as we saw. But the treatment of girls of color within the organization exposed the disparities and disunities within this family and showed that not all girls were equal members in this sisterhood. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that the GFS continues to exist today, but its popularity began to decline in the interwar years. And there's complex reasons for why it begins to decline. But its exclusionary practices and its continued prioritization of whiteness meant that it failed to reach a significant population of girls and was a crucial factor in its waning influence. Girls perceived the organization, moreover, as old-fashioned, and they found other organizations like the Girl Guides more welcoming and attentive to their needs. Now, the GFS would actually form its own Girl Guide companies within the organization as a way to stem the tide of this decline, but ultimately it was too little too late. There were really more systemic problems that the GFS could not solve. Now, the GFS does exist today, but its worldwide membership is only around 20,000 girls. And to put that number in comparison, the World Association of Girl Guides and Girl Scouts has over 10.8 million members. So the decision of girls to leave or not even join the organization at all due to its racist policies or because the voices of girls were ignored reveals another way that they pushed back against the imperatives of the GFS leadership and broader imperial goals. So far from being peripheral and insignificant figures in the empire, girls had a critical role in not only constructing colonial societies and identities, but also disrupting them. Girls' lives and ideas of girlhood were and continue to be intertwined with conceptualizations of empire, nation, and race. The narratives constructed around girls from the colonial era have far-reaching consequences and reverberate down to the present day. We need only to look at stories like the kidnapping of the Chibok schoolgirls by Boko Haram in Nigeria in 2014 to see how the legacies of colonialism still shape girls' lives today. Their kidnapping sparked global outrage, yet much of the coverage failed to acknowledge that this story was part of a longer history of colonialism, and in part, a consequence of colonial policies that imposed artificial borders, reinforced patriarchal structures that marginalized girls and women, and fostered ethnic and religious divisions. Moreover, reports echoed earlier colonial era narratives, including portraying African nations as backward and girls as non-agential figures and passive victims in need of rescue by Western nations, something that we saw was a prominent theme in pageants and plays. So this is just one example that illustrates how the legacies of British colonialism are not confined to the history books. They are ongoing realities that shape the lives and experiences of girls around the world. Girls continue to serve as central sites of political, economic, social, and cultural contestations. And by centering girls in imperial history, we can gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of how the empire functioned, and also how its legacies continue to shape the world today, including the lives of girls today. Thank you.